I'm Millie Weaver, and you're watching the Millennial Millie Show. Well, today's a very exciting day because I have something fun and interesting to announce. So, the QUX TV boxes, which I'm sure many of you guys have heard about or seen advertisements for played on my show, we are now testing out the live streaming function on the QUX TV boxes. So, we're going to show you guys more about that later on into the stream. But first, let's talk about how Nancy Pelosi is being booed everywhere she goes now. Gee, I can't help but wonder if this has to do with the failing economy right now and the people in New York City. Mind you, New York tends to be a blue state, okay? It's a very, very blue city, New York. But Nancy Pelosi, when she got up on stage recently, she was booed by the audience. And it wasn't just like one or two people. She was booed rather loudly. So take a look at this clip right here, just to kind of give you an idea of how the American people are feeling and how her own constituents are feeling about her. These are Democrats. This is a blue state, a blue city that she's in. Why is she being booed by her own? All right, so there you have it. I mean, she's clearly, it almost sounds like she's trying to lecture them at the very end there, like, your actions have a consequence. And they're just like, boo. No, we know that your actions, your policies, your Democrat policies have consequences. Elections have consequences. And that's what many people in these blue cities are having to find out the hard way when we see how these cities, okay, are wanting to take in more and more of these illegal immigrants and then put that burden on the American taxpayer. So New York City wants $500 million to house these new migrants that are coming to New York City. So while the American people are broke right now and struggling to just get by, to put gas in their cars, to pay for these exorbitantly high food prices, no, we need to give more money to other causes than helping the American people. All right? It's a mess. So is there any wonder why Nancy Pelosi herself is being booed? Well, just to let you guys know, we have confirmation right now that I am now live streaming live on QUX TV. So on the QUX TV boxes, you've seen QUX right here. Here's their website, which I have my very own QUX TV box. Here's what it looks like inside where I'm live streaming, right? I am live streaming right now. So let's see if our cameraman can go ahead and pan over to the TV I have here and show that I'm live streaming.
1 second. Little technical issue here.
So here we go. There's my little thumbnail of me in my red dress. There we are, live streaming, which obviously it's showing a picture of the TV because that's what our camera's pointed at right now. But for those people, those users at home who have their QUX TV boxes, they are now able to watch me live stream, and various stream keys are being given out to people with big platforms, but also the live streaming function is going to be opened up very shortly to everyone on there. So that's a very exciting thing. That's exciting news. And it means I'm one step away from being continually censored and shut down by YouTube and these other social media platforms that want to restrict what I can and can't say or who I can and can't have on as a guest on my platform. Enough of that. I'm sick and tired of being told what I can and can't say. I'm sick and tired of my videos being flagged and deleted. Videos that have important historical records on them, mind you, where literally one video that they deleted was actually me talking about how there was an inside source they had that was saying that there was going to be some kind of coming biological event or biological attack. And that was literally a couple months before COVID-19. So they're just deleting my content across the board on these many social media platforms and restricting my access to be able to live stream. Recently, I was actually banned for a couple weeks from live streaming on YouTube because they said one of the videos that I posted or live streamed had medical misinformation in it. Yet, in the video that I reviewed, there was not really anywhere that I was actually talking about COVID or COVID-19 in general. So it's just a racket. They're censoring people. And so this is exciting news. All right, so let's move on here. Let's talk about some of the hypocrisy here, though, in censorship. So Bernie Sanders, right? We all remember back in 2016 when we had Hillary Clinton battling Bernie Sanders, and you actually had massive protests, pretty much riots practically, outside of the DNC in Philadelphia, claiming and screaming about that Hillary Clinton had her primary, that Hillary Clinton stole the primary election from Bernie Sanders, okay? Literally, people were outside chanting, "Don't vote for Hillary, she's killing black people." People were jumping over the fences. Law enforcement was having to catch and apprehend the people that were scaling the fences and arrest them. It was about to go down because the Bernie people were convinced that Bernie Sanders had the election stolen from them. But remind you, when the Democrats, contest election results or say they think something's going on, they're allowed to, right? Because rules for thee and none for me. That's how that works. And this video here recently with Bernie Sanders on NBC's late night show really illustrates that they can pretty much talk about things that we can't talk about as conservatives because they have a free pass. They have a free speech card. We don't, because remember, they say we're extremists. When we say the same thing, we're an extremist. But when they say it, they're allowed to say it. All right, so let's go ahead and go to this clip.
We're in rough shape right now. This is the reality. And this is what we have to do to get out of it. But I think, Seth, being honest with the American people, talking about the growing gap between the very rich and everybody else, you got 3 people in America own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. You got 3 Wall Street firms that have assets of $20 trillion, major stockholders in hundreds and hundreds of companies throughout America. You got billionaires buying elections right now. You're following what's going on. So we got to be honest with the American people about what's going on, about who owns and...
Did you catch that? He said, so we've got billionaires buying elections. Oh, so was that what happened when Mark Zuckerberg gave over $400 million to swing states to ensure that they got out the blue vote? Right? Was that what happened? So I guess the problem is this whole time we were using the word stole, and maybe this whole time we should have just been using the word bought. So Bernie Sanders says that elections are being bought by billionaires. So I guess it just depends on which end of the transaction you're on, right? Interesting how he's allowed to say this live on TV, and that's perfectly fine. But see, Trump, he says things about election integrity and what happened in the 2020 election, and it is called the big lie by these left-wing media outlets. And he talks about how it fueled a new generation of social media influencers that basically, they claim, grifted off of conning people into believing that there could ever be any discrepancy, that there could ever be any shenanigans in our election. Yet the entire time in 2016, we heard nothing except throughout the 4 years President Trump was in office, nothing but contesting of the election, Russian interference, Russian bots. That's all we heard the entire time. But I digress, okay? This is just the current situation. Now, Putin has recently granted Edward Snowden Russian citizenship. Let's talk more about this, and let's definitely talk more about Putin, because there's a lot going on in the country right now in Ukraine, and things are definitely heating up here. But it is interesting to see how Vladimir Putin granted Edward Snowden citizenship and what that actually is saying. What message is he sending across to the U.S. right now? You know, I know the U.S. wanted him to extradite Edward Snowden because they want to put him on trial and punish him for his crimes, right? But Putin's now saying, nope, he's a citizen. And I think that this is partially because, to me, it represents Russia kind of giving up on trying to have diplomatic relationships with the U.S. and with NATO and these other Western countries, because of what's happening in Ukraine. Things are, let's just say, heating up quite a bit. So Putin recently came out and threatened nuclear war. All right. And this is only escalating now. I mean, we've already heard him make a threat and say, this is not a bluff. This is going to happen if you guys don't stop. Russia will nuke Europe. Russia will use nuclear means to protect itself. That's pretty much what Putin has said in a nutshell. But now that we've seen what appears to be, Russia is claiming that there has been sabotage on the Nord Stream pipelines. So there's Nord Stream 1 and there's Nord Stream 2, these pipelines that really, it goes directly from Russia through the sea down into Germany. All right. And if you actually look at a map of what's going on here, you can clearly see that the whole point of this Nord Stream pipeline, which you can see right here, Nord Stream 1, right, and Nord Stream 2. This is 1, this is 2. And they go down through the Baltic Sea, down directly into Germany. And it essentially goes around Ukraine, right? Because typically the Russian pipelines actually go through Ukraine. And I'm going to show you guys a quick little clip here just so you guys can understand why this entire conflict right now going on in Ukraine has everything to do with energy. It has everything to do with these gas pipelines because Russia is very dependent on Europe's money, and Europe is extraordinarily dependent on Russia's gas. The problem is that Ukraine is caught in the middle of this ugly fight. So that is why we're seeing this battle over Ukraine right now really escalating. And you can see why Russia definitely sees it as a threat. But at the same time, for Europe, they see not having their hands somewhat in Ukraine as a very much a vulnerability, right? Because they're so dependent on Russia. So let's take a look at this clip here so you guys can kind of get a good idea of how these pipelines play into the conflict in Ukraine right now.
Designed to double the flow of Russian gas directly to Germany. But with the Ukrainian crisis deepening, Germany froze its participation in the $11 billion project.
Essentially now having 4 big gas corridors from Russia to Europe, one through the Baltic Sea, one through Belarus, one through Turkey, all of which are controlled by Russia, as well as the one through Ukraine, which is still not controlled by Russia. And that has always upset the Russians, and they wanted to circumvent it in order to get rid of this choke point in Ukraine.
As of 2019, Ukrainian state-owned oil and gas company Naftogaz collected $3 billion a year in transit fees from Russian gas moving through its country. Crude oil and natural gas revenue made up, on average, about 43% of Russia's total annual revenue between 2011 and 2020. Each day, oil payments from Europe to Russia total about $285 million. In 2021, the European Union imported 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia. Germany alone gets half of its gas from the country. But more than a month after its invasion, and with a widening number of sanctions, why is Russian natural gas still flowing through Ukraine?
Even during this.
So basically, what they're getting at here is even despite this conflict in Ukraine, the gas has not stopped flowing to Europe, and Russia is still receiving money from Europe. So they're so dependent on each other for these exchanges that they haven't even stopped despite the Ukrainian conflict that's happening. I mean, bombs are flying, buildings are being blown up. Putin is threatening nuclear war. We're pretty much on the verge of we're in, I would say, a Cold War now, when we have talks of nuclear weapons being thrown around from really both sides. It's almost as though both sides are making these threats. And this is all because of the gas pipelines that go literally from Russia down into Ukraine. And the problem here is that most of it's going through Ukraine, right? So when most of these pipelines are going through Ukraine, and you have Ukraine getting a good fee on the flow of that gas coming through their country, you can see why the European nations and why both Russia are kind of fighting for that control over Ukraine. Because if something goes wrong with Ukraine and it favors one side or the other, it could be devastating for the opposing side. So, hence why we see this really hard stance from Putin as to, you better not mess around in Ukraine. You better not try to take Ukraine, which Ukraine was previously part of Soviet Russia. So they already naturally kind of see it as more of part of Ukraine than its own independent country or part of Europe, which the European side, they're really pushing to allow Ukraine to be its own independent nation that is recognized by NATO and joins NATO. And Russia has been very adamant that it is not to join NATO. So this is why we're seeing this escalation here. And so do I think that it could result in nuclear war between Europe and Russia, or between the US and Russia? Well, I do think that it's quite possible, because of how dependent these nations are on each other, that some of this could just be bluffing. Some of it could just be talk in order to try to scare the other side away, or, because they're still receiving, Russia's still very dependent on the money economically from Europe. And because Europe would literally have massive energy problems without Russian gas. I mean, it's one of those things where it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell, but you can tell that either which way, it could be devastating for Europe. It could be devastating for Russia, whichever way it goes. I know that Russia's already being hit hard by the sanctions that the U.S. has put on Russia and Russian oil and gas. So they're already being impacted economically somewhat. And then let's talk a little bit about Nord Stream 2. Now, this is important. Let's watch this clip here. And I just want you to look at this animation here, mostly for the reasoning being, I want you to pay attention to these pipelines and where they're coming through. You're going to see most of them are coming through Ukraine, but then you're going to notice that Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 goes around Ukraine. All right. And those are more newly built pipelines. Right. And they're very contentious. OK, especially Nord Stream 2. The whole thing has been very contentious. So go ahead and watch this clip.
Prices. By 2009, around 80% of Russian gas heading to Europe ran via Ukraine. Gazprom was supplying 25% of Europe's needs. At the same time, Russia was adding additional capacity. In the 2010s, the 760-mile-long Nord Stream pipeline connecting Russia with Germany via the Baltic Sea began operations. A decade later, the Turk Stream natural gas pipeline connecting Russia's largest gas reserves with southern Europe via Turkey kicked off. Construction was completed in 2021 on the Nord Stream 2, a companion pipeline designed to double the flow of Russian gas directly to Germany. But with the Ukrainian crisis deep...
Okay, so pay attention here how we see the yellow were the old original pipelines, the blue being the more recent, newer pipelines. And a lot of this is to get out of being so dependent on Ukraine, where Russia feels that Ukraine is kind of like a choke point, and they have to pay a lot of money in fees for their gas to flow through there. But there's also a lot of other political tensions and things, obviously, between Ukraine and Russia. But so Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 is Russia's way of circumventing Ukraine, okay, as well as the Turk Stream. But even more so Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, because they're providing to Germany, and Germany is very dependent on that gas, and they get a lot of their money from Europe and from that gas. So this is why we're seeing the conflict, okay? And this is why just recently, this news article where you see them talking about how Nord Stream pipelines were just hit with several leaks. And Russia is claiming they believe that it is sabotage. And now Russia's saying that it has the right to use nuclear weapons to defend itself. Okay? That's why we're seeing this escalation right here. Because if the European countries take Ukraine, which Russia's losing its fight in Ukraine right now. So if they take Ukraine and then they actually impair Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 in its function because they've been sabotaged or hit with leaks, what they're doing is they're really backing Putin into a corner. They're putting him, he's like a caged animal or a cornered animal right now. So if there's ever a time period where he would strike and possibly use nuclear weapons or some kind of drastic means, I mean, I think we're kind of in that window right now. That's not to say that he could just be bluffing. I don't know. He's come out and said, don't take it as a bluff. So what I'm saying is contradictory, but you never know how diplomacy works. A lot of it's stagecraft. You don't know. But so the U.S. has now chimed back at Russia after Russia made threats and says it told the Kremlin that Russia will face catastrophic consequences if it uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So now the U.S. is threatening Russia back, you better not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Okay? Which, what does that mean? Are we now, would you say we're now in a Cold War with Russia? I mean, when you hear threats of nuclear war going up, you very well could see that. And this is why this is hilarious, okay? Well, obviously nuclear war is never hilarious. So I'm going to correct myself on that. All right, it's a serious thing, but we knew this was going to happen if Biden became president, okay? And that's why this is just, it's like one of those things where you just, there's nothing you can do other than sit there and just go, well, we told you this was going to happen. You know, Biden, the war hawk, the military-industrial complex war hawk, is wanting to pretty much escalate things in Ukraine, which he has been there in the whole mix of that, escalating the entire time. And now we're literally on the verge of a nuclear holocaust or nuclear war between Europe, Russia, Ukraine, the U.S. It could just get really ugly really fast. So check out this little clip from Shadowgate 2 where we predicted this.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
You believe that Vice President...
So that was pretty much a little clip from Shadowgate 2 where we're pretty much trying to make the point where Joe Biden is the military-industrial complex president and he will drag us into nuclear war. And that's not what we're seeing. It's not a pretty day. So Russia's former president said that nuclear threats are not a bluff and that NATO won't step in if Russia nukes Ukraine. Which possibly, I mean, I kind of find that hard to believe, but at the same time, what will happen to NATO countries? What will happen to Germany without Russian gas? Like I said, they're very dependent on that Russian gas. So even if a nuke goes off in Ukraine, will we see Europe do something? That's the real question. Will Europe do something? Currently, they're already having massive energy problems in Europe. They're already having an energy crisis, and they're saying that it will get very bad this year. So if you have friends and family or loved ones in Europe, you know, definitely let them know that they need to prepare themselves because the energy problems right now in Europe are only going to get worse. So what Europe's in a scramble to do right now, because they are largely dependent on the Russian gas pipelines, the Russian gas, for their energy, electricity, all of that, right? they are in a scramble right now to try to get some more nuclear energy solutions and some coal plants up and running to be able to handle themselves, so that Europe doesn't essentially collapse. Because if Europe has no energy, you could imagine things turning into a crisis really fast. Okay? So they're trying to figure out other solutions. It's a very sad situation. It's a very ugly situation. But, this is why we're supposed to have and elect good leaders of countries that will work together diplomatically and will talk to each other. We'll try to figure out solutions. We'll try to work together. Obviously, Europe and Russia need each other. And for quite some time, they've worked well with having this kind of interdependent relationship. Why now do we need to have them going into pretty much a nuclear war with each other? Well, it's just failing diplomacy. Okay. So are we now going to be seeing these speeches eerily reminiscent of that of JFK during the Cold War? Let's go to this clip.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Fourth, as a necessary military precaution, I have reinforced our base at Guantanamo, evacuated today the dependents of our personnel there, in order to...
So, is this where we're at now? Are we in a Cold War? That is the question that we should all be wondering right now. I mean, are we going to be seeing those old videos where they're teaching children to, if they see the white flashing light, that they should duck and cover? I mean, is that where we're at right now, where we can't just have leaders try to make peace?
It's the turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they are talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking her teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb may explode? And her teacher...
So, as if COVID-19 wasn't enough for children to have to psychologically cope with and handle, what kind of trauma is this causing the young children in these generations? Many of our children are school-aged, right? And they've already been through lockdowns, mask mandates, compulsory vaccinations. They've been through that kind of trauma. And now, are we going to be going into a Cold War time period where they're going to have to worry about nuclear bombs and explosions and war with Russia? It's ridiculous, all right? I'm going to keep you updated on this news and information as it continues on. I'm Millie Weaver, and you're watching The Millennial Millie Show.